from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. We have a few strategic risk assessment things to talk about today. And I should let you know that here in the near future, we're going to kind of mix it up a little bit. I'm going to bring on some guests to interview. It won't be just you listening to me, but we're going to kind of move this right along and talk about, I'm really going to focus on Europe more than anything else. It's not that there aren't a lot of things happening around the world. And I've been talking about the Middle East and Gaza and the potential of the ceasefire there falling apart. And certainly talking about enough other things around the world as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe. This is a big week. We had the Ukraine, essentially this coordination group that we have that coordinates with all our European allies. In fact, not just European, all our global allies, supporting Ukraine in the war with Russia. And so we had that going this week. Followed on the heels of that in Munich was the Munich Security Conference, one of the biggest security conferences every year. It brings in leaders from all over, really all over the world, but certainly all over Europe, because that's the primary focus of it. And it was an interesting week, to say the least. Vice President Vance was over there. Our new Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, was over there. This was his first debut, if you will, on the global stage, doing something like this. And Secretary Rubio rolled in, although I will say that I think Secretary Rubio is pretty much living on a plane anymore. He has been back and forth and all over the world doing stuff at a rather prodigious rate since he became the Secretary of State. So I have to say, rather impressed with, if nothing else, his stamina in terms of all of his travel going on. But let's talk about the United States, Europe, and Ukraine. As I mentioned, we saw the Vice President, the new Secretary of Defense, show up in Europe. And basically, let me just start out with softball first, but basically telling the Europeans they kind of have to step it up, if you will. Explaining Secretary of Defense Hegseth made this very clear that we have interests elsewhere, pointing to the West Pacific and China in terms of our defense interests, that Europe is not our priority defense. We could talk quite a while about the language that he used. In fact, I will mention a few things here, but let's just say that it was very much bordering on confrontational with our European allies. But I'm not just going to sit there. I'm not just going to chastise the way he said it. Right? There was a little bit of history there we need to go into. But let's just say that with both what Vice President Vance, Secretary Hegseth said, it kind of went over like a lead balloon with a lot of European leaders in the European capitals. The Germans were particularly irritated with the way it was brought about, and they expressed certain displeasure quite apparently immediately following that. At most, I think pretty much both of these officials may have been met with some polite applause, but it was not anything that was, let's just say there was a number of leaders that just kind of sat there in a little bit stunned disbelief with what they were hearing. In general, the Europeans do not like being lectured to by the U.S. With that said, it's not the first time that the U.S. has had to lecture Europeans. Don't forget, the U.S., going back for a very long time, World War I and particularly World War II, we basically went into World War I and saved France and Britain from this horrific stalemate and basically turned that war around. And then World War II, basically, we were the arsenal of democracy. We went in, we kept Britain from basically collapsing, and we basically fought our way across North Africa and then to Europe and defeated Nazi Germany. And then we were the arsenal of democracy, the stalwart defender during the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the menace of communism worldwide. So we have a history of being the backstop, if you will, for Europe. And we also have a history of occasionally going to Europe and lecturing them and chastising them for things that they've done or they should be doing or they're not doing. So this is not the first time that's happened. But it was a distinct departure from what they had heard over the previous 4 years with the Biden administration. Now, if you really want to talk about where we are today, I kind of have to move some things along. We've been the guarantor of peace, obviously. And yes, we were there. We liberated Europe from Nazi Germany and everything. But the first real break that we saw with Europe, one would say it kind of went back to 56, the Suez Crisis, when Britain, France, and Israel basically tried to regain control, if you will, of the Suez Canal from Nasser's Egypt. Well, that was the first time that we really stepped in and put our foot down and said, no, you got to knock this off. You're no longer these big colonial powers, and you can't do things like this. And then in the 60s, we saw the big break with de Gaulle, who had been basically the French general that we had backed in World War II with the Free French Forces, and had led the French forces while we stormed across France and Europe and eventually defeated Nazi Germany. Well, de Gaulle was very much a French nationalist, and he really chided at U.S. control over NATO. And in the 60s, he basically pulled French forces from active collaboration on a day-to-day basis, working side by side with the NATO allies. And the NATO headquarters actually moved from France, from around Paris, to up to Belgium, where it is today, because of that break. So it's not the first time we've had fissures in the North Atlantic Alliance. Let's just put it that way. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's been kind of interesting with NATO. Certainly, the first Trump administration would chastise NATO quite a bit, chastise European countries in NATO for not contributing enough. And there was a lot of discussion whether NATO was becoming, certainly at a time they're saying, is it still relevant without this big monolithic Soviet Union threat? What is the purpose for NATO? That was being discussed. And then we had the war on terror, 9/11, and a number of our European allies in NATO stepped up and became part of the coalition of the willing. They were actively engaged in combat operations in Iraq. They were engaged in combat operations in Afghanistan, fighting Islamic extremist terrorists, primarily Al-Qaeda, but others as well. And, I served overseas with Germans and Czechs in the Middle East. After side by side, we had French that were there. They weren't there in force, but they were there represented with where they're. So anyway, this has been something that we have. We've enjoyed a very robust relationship with the war on terror with them as well, but things are changing. We're no longer engaged in these big operations. We're completely out of Afghanistan. The Iraq war is done, and so these wars kind of rolled up, and then we had this kind of emerging thing with Russia trying to reassert its Russian empire, if you will, and of course invading Ukraine in full force in 2022, and here we are. And with that, if you were to go back last year, the big discussion was that NATO has never been more relevant than it is today. And of course, the U.S. was very much fully backing it. But there's been a change of administration. And one of this is it's an administration that's coming in that's still very irritated that the Europeans have not stepped up with what they feel that they should be doing. And there is a little bit of history here. If you look at the war in Ukraine, when the war broke out, the U.S. jumps in immediately. We're sending Javelin missiles. We're sending Stinger missiles. Eventually our contribution went to tanks, artillery pieces, HIMARS missiles, all this amazing equipment, ordnance, financial support, all this other stuff. But a lot of us do remember when this started, the Germans, who were a heck of a lot closer to Ukraine than the U.S., the Germans started out, they after a lot of hand-wringing and everything, they sent 4,000 helmets to Ukraine, as if 4,000 helmets was going to make a decisive difference in fighting off this massive Russian force. Well, that has stuck in the minds of many, which is our European allies just didn't seem to be putting the amount of money they should in defense. And now when there's this exigent thing and they're talking about, the U.S. needs to be more, needs to maintain its commitment, stuff like that, everyone's remembering, that, Europeans didn't really step up like they should have when this whole thing kicked off. And it's this lack of European resolve, and it varies by countries, don't get me wrong. Poles and certainly the Baltic states and now the new countries, Finland, Sweden, very much leaning forward. But you have other countries that don't lean forward quite as much. And if you get down to Southern Europe, particularly Spain, Portugal, Italy, They're just not, they're well below the 2% threshold that was the goal back in the first Trump administration. And now the new Trump administration, Donald Trump's come out and said they should be investing 5% of their gross domestic product in defense. And frankly, I don't think any country in Europe is there yet. Maybe one of the Baltic states is pretty darn close, as I recall. But that's the new goal. And we've been pointing out that, hey, look at the map. If you're in Eastern Europe, you're right next to Russia. That's where the big threat's coming from. Why are we putting so much money in defense? And we got oceans between us, or an ocean between us and Europe. And yet here you are right on the border, and you're not putting that much in. Now the Poles are. And the Poles have a little bit of a history there. You know, one of the things with Poland, and it's the same thing that the Ukrainians have, is it's the tyranny of terrain, if you want to put it that way. Poland is generally flat. You know, rolling hills, flat, that's Poland. And Ukraine, it varies a little bit. You'll have undulating hills, but for the most part, pretty flat. You know, not a lot of, look, there's no Alps in Ukraine. There's no Alps in Poland, all right? There's no Black Sea that separates Poland from the rest of the European continent or anything. That's just the fact is they are where they are. Historically, armies would roll in on horses and run right over Poland. And more recently, tanks and armored personnel carriers and stuff would roll across Poland, and they're stuck. And Ukraine's got some of the same issues in that regard. All right. So with that said, there should be a requirement. They should be investing more simply because of where they are. That does make more sense that they would be putting the bulk of their investment in there. And so part of what the U.S. is chastising them on is somewhat intuitive, which is, yes, look where you are and look what you should be putting towards this. And though we haven't quite put it this way, there's problems we have with the Ukrainians. You know, the Ukrainians did this kind of levy and mass mobilization when the Russians invaded. And then as the thing's going on, they have a conscription thing where you don't get conscripted to your age 27. Which we kind of shake our heads and go, what is this? Your country's very existence is in doubt. And you don't want to conscript anyone in the military till they're age 27. They eventually, after a lot of debate and everything, they moved it down to 25. And their thinking is, well, you know, we want to give people a chance to have some sort of life before they go off to the military where they might be killed. And this is all wonderful coffee shop discussion. I think you could sit around and have a latte and discuss this all day long, and it has absolutely nothing to do with their national defense. It has nothing to do with the survival of Ukraine. If you're going to take your national security, and I'm going to be very blunt, if the Ukrainians are going to take it that lightly that they don't want to dedicate their own people to defending it, you're going to run into some problems with worldwide feelings on that. You know, Taiwan's got some of the same issues. They have also not mobilized their nation like they should in terms of having everybody ready to fight should the Chinese invade. So that is a big issue. They need to address that. Manpower is a big issue in Ukraine, and they haven't addressed that. And the investment by other NATO countries, and also these countries, one of the big discussions in Europe is bringing back conscription. Now, some countries in Europe never stopped conscripting. They always had national service. A lot of countries, after the end of the Cold War, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union, they eventually went to a voluntary system. And some countries like Britain is, you know, their system is just completely broken. They have underinvested for so long that the great British Army, the great British Navy, the great British everything is a shadow of what it used to be. So they've really got to step it up. So there are some real problems, and there are reasons why we are very critical of our allies over there. All right. Now, with that said, obviously, the other problem is President Trump called Putin. Before he called Zelensky, he called Putin to talk about Ukraine. Obviously, that really irritated Ukraine, and it really irritated our European allies. And though the U.S. is, by and large, the largest contributor, I think we still contribute most of the money, most of the aid, military especially, going into Ukraine. The Europeans are stepping it up. They're getting close to almost parity with the U.S. in that regard. They were well below parity for most of the war, but they are starting to catch up in that regard. And so they do have a say in this matter, and it is a European security issue at the end of the day. I think we've kind of made that clear. But the White House kind of bypassing the Europeans, bypassing Ukraine itself to talk about the Russo-Ukraine war directly with Russia, that really irritated the Europeans. And then the other thing is that there was discussion of maybe President Trump having a summit with Putin in Saudi Arabia, and it didn't sound like the Ukrainians and Europeans would be invited. And that really set them off as well, or set off the Europeans, and it didn't really thrill the Ukrainians very much. And then Secretary Hagestad goes in and talks to the Ukraine coordination group and basically says, it says we need to, Putin, or basically saying Russia is never going to agree to having Ukraine as a NATO member. And that really irritated not just Ukraine, it irritated all the NATO members, because it took so much to get that agreement that Ukraine was on a, quote, irreversible path, unquote, into NATO membership. All the stuff that had to be done with that, all the diplomacy and everything, and then to have the U.S. kind of just throw a monkey wrench in and say, nope, they're not going to do that. And also elevating the status of Russia, telling Russia that it has a vote on NATO membership. Well, at least that's the way the Europeans would see it. That really kind of set off everyone because, frankly, from the NATO perspective or the European perspective, that's an issue between NATO and Ukraine, not one where Putin gets to put a vote in on whether or not Ukraine becomes a NATO member. The other part was that the Ukraine would have to give up sovereignty over some of its territory or sovereign claim on some of its territory, or at least control over its sovereign territory. And, of course, both of these concessions are on the table. And the Europeans not consulted before this was thrown out, obviously irritating the Europeans, irritating the heck out of the Ukrainians. And then, of course, the other part is that it really kind of leaves, we basically giving up stuff. The U.S. is verbally giving up stuff. But the question came up the very next day to Secretary Hagestad, and it was from a Fox News reporter, said, well, what is Russia giving up? What is Russia? What's the reciprocity from Russia on this? And frankly, to make a long story short, he didn't have a good answer. In fact, I didn't really hear much of an answer on that. And that was rather frustrating, I think, for everyone. That was and I have to tell you, part of it, he's not young. He's in his mid-40s, but he's never served in a position like this before. It's his first rollout on the world stage. But, I kind of hear what the Senate Armed Services Committee chairman said. He goes, that was kind of a rookie mistake, quote unquote, and on that. And you need to be ready for questions like that. They're going to ask those questions. And of course, the criticism was that you're giving all these things up before the negotiations have even begun. These are things that you should be negotiating. Don't give them up to go into the negotiation. As much criticism as the Trump administration or Donald Trump has thrown at Barack Obama over the years, because one of the things Barack Obama would always do is he'd go in with his best position as his going in position, which gave him nowhere to negotiate. Well, this is kind of the same thing. You're going in and giving Putin what he's asking for without any negotiation. So let's just say that has not gone well this week. All right. The other thing, too, is there's been an issue. It came up over the last couple of weeks of Donald Trump had talked about access to Ukrainian rare earths. Ukraine is one of the countries in the world that has a lot of rare earths. It's one of the top 10 countries, tremendous rare earths deposits. Also has a lot of oil and gas. Interesting, has a tremendous amount of oil and gas underwater in the Black Sea in the exclusive economic zone that is actually sovereign in terms of sovereignty, should be controlled or owned by Ukraine. But if Russia ends up keeping Crimea, then a lot of that oil and gas would suddenly be in the Russia's exclusive economic zone, which that is a whole debate discussion I imagine they're going to have in whatever peace negotiations in terms of exploiting that. But anyway, he brought up that. He brought up basically the natural resources of Ukraine and the U.S. get in a position. Right. Now, the U.S. desperately needs access to these rare earths for our high-tech industry, high-tech manufacturing, everything from quantum computers to wind generation machines off the coast or whatever. Basically, there's a lot of need for all these rare earths. Over the last few decades, China has cornered the market on this. Now, China is a big country, physically speaking. They have some interesting terrain that has a lot of interesting mineral deposits. So some of it was just natural advantage of being where they are. A lot of it, though, was by design. They undercut other rare earth processing facilities, plants, if you will, around the world. So they end up getting a corner on the market. They very aggressively, some would say diabolically, went around locking in contracts, pushing out rare earths mining in areas that they could never control, to include the United States. And they basically undercut Europe's and the U.S. and actually North America's position in this arena to a great deal. One of the reasons that we're probably so interested in doing something with Greenland, in fact, it's not a hidden reason, is because Greenland has rare earths along with a lot of other minerals that we're very interested in mining. So this is a big issue. Now, with all that said, the U.S. mentioned that there's about $500 billion in rare earths and other minerals that Ukraine has that we'd like to get our hands on. That's $500 billion. I want to throw that number down, if you will. However, our administration just also told the Europeans that they're now going to take over responsibility for Ukraine, which is kind of interesting because it would seem to kind of undercut the leverage that we might have in that regard. I'm not saying it's irreversible. I'm not saying they couldn't fix it. But if you're telling the Europeans, hey, you've got Ukraine, we're pulling out, you got it, I have a feeling that Ukraine would say, okay, let's cut a deal with the European countries. And I can tell you personally, I've worked in this, not rare earths per se, but I've worked in stuff like the lithium market. I have seen our European allies, if you will, companies from there very aggressively going around the world, trying to lock in contracts, trying to lock in access to things like lithium from South America, elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, Africa, things all over. And because of that, I can tell you that if we're going to have a tough time getting a deal that gives us consideration, rare earths access, let alone oil and gas from Ukraine, if we're not a full party to helping Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and its independence from Russia. And I would be very concerned if anyone is thinking that somewhere in the future that Russia is going to be a reliable source of rare earths and other mineral deposits. That's been a big problem. I would hope we've learned a lesson there about that. The other thing that came up was this issue of essentially Russia with its frozen assets, its seized frozen assets, if you will. The U.S. has some of this. The vast majority of these frozen assets, whether it's bank accounts or real property, real estate, boats, planes, whatever, most of that is controlled in Europe. A lot of it's controlled in Belgium, Britain, various countries. The U.S. only has a small portion of that. But there was already, under the Biden administration, a move where they actually obligated the profits that comes to those $300 billion in assets to obligated it as collateral to pay for aid going over to Ukraine. And that was very interesting. And President Zelensky of Ukraine has talked about using that time and again, and especially more recent weeks, about using that as a way to provide aid to Ukraine. And essentially telling the U.S., hey, look, you don't have to give us $100 billion or $80 billion or $70 billion, whatever. Just take those assets and use those to keep us going. And there's a very interesting thing there. Now, part of that is he's talking about actually liquidating those assets and using that. And that's one way to do it. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they don't want to do that, because they don't want to set a precedent in the international system of just, capriciously seizing assets. And that's, some would say it's capricious, but, seizing those assets, because once you start going down that road, other countries could reciprocate, and pretty soon you don't have a global economy anymore, because every country is worried that all of its assets will immediately get seized. That was something that we saw happen a lot after World War II. Over with the first, 20, 30 years, we saw, U.S. European companies saw their assets getting seized all over the place and nationalized, if you will, and losing their position. So we don't want to get back into that. On the other hand, this potentially obligating the potential profits, that's interesting. At some point you go, well, where is the top end of that? I don't know. It depends on how long they're seized. And you could potentially obligate probably up until the full amount of the 300 billion based on it'll be paid back with profits. I would imagine, I mean, that could take 10, 15, 20 years before it's all done, but it's interesting. And that's a lever that could be held over the Russians, which is, okay, you want to keep fighting, you want to keep doing this. Here's the deal. We're going to obligate, $75, $80 billion, $100 billion, whatever, every year. And so by the time we get to year 3, all those assets, the whole value of that $300 billion has been completely obligated for payoff. And you're going to keep losing this until you come to the peace table and make a reasonable deal. That is tremendous leverage. And if there is some hidden agenda that the White House is thinking that may be a way to go, I think that would be a brilliant move if they do it. But I haven't seen that. I haven't heard of it, but it could be done. And frankly, if you look at that and then look at potential consideration that can be done with the rare earth stuff, they could probably get $100 billion a year going into the Ukrainian war. And by the way, Ukraine's going to need this when the war ends. They still have to buy a lot of stuff to build up this big military, a military big enough to fend off any potential future Russian actions against Ukraine. So there's going to be an investment there that goes on for many years. So this is something I think they need to really take a look at. Instead of U.S. taxpayer dollars going to pay for them directly, using some of the stuff, the Ukrainians have the rare earth capability, rare earth stuff. They've got oil and gas that can be obligated towards this with consideration for that. And then, of course, the $300 billion in assets. And frankly, most experts would say that the Russian economy, a lot of experts, not all, but many have said that, look, this is about the last year that Putin can keep going at the way he's going. His phenomenal losses on the battlefield, he's right now, Ukraine has more tanks on the battlefield than Russia does. I think they got more armored personnel carriers. I'm not sure. Russia's pulling some stuff out, from the 50s, and I'm waiting for them to bring out the World War II stuff out of Cosmoline and throw that on the battlefield. They're using horses and mules to move equipment on the battlefield. This looks like Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. So the ability of Russia to maintain this, economically speaking, maintain their military, if it lasts through 2025, I think most would be rather surprised if they could do this. So there is a point here where Russia is particularly vulnerable if they can sustain the pressure on the Russian military. And by the way, whatever is lost today with the Russian military is something you don't have to face tomorrow in a future war with Russia. So that really benefits NATO in a big way. Anyway, a lot there to chew on, a lot to think about. Dare I say we live in interesting times, to paraphrase the Chinese quote, or Chinese curse, if you will. There are some tremendous opportunities. The U.S. and Europe needs to capitalize its defense industrial base. It needs to build up its capability, its production lines for ammunition, for planes, for tanks, for all these things that are going to be needed in war. We need that, particularly to get ready to ramp up so we have a robust defense industrial capability should we get involved with a rather prolonged war in the Pacific, which many are thinking is quite possible. The folly of strategic thinking is to think that you're going to get in a war and it's going to be over very quickly. The reality is these wars tend to go on and on and on, so you need to have a robust industrial base, defense industrial base to do that. There is an ability, leveraging the Ukraine situation with everything I just talked about, to capitalize and really build up that industrial base to produce ammunition, planes, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and actually the second, third order effects in doing things with maybe ships and amphibious shipping and stuff like that we really do need in this regard. I think there's an opportunity here. However, historically, the U.S. has kind of drifted. We did this before World War II into this whole, very America first isolationist thinking, and you're hearing that rhetoric very distinctly right now. And then we end up paying for it. We end up paying for it because things go so bad overseas because we're disengaged that all of a sudden we're responding to an emergency. It's like emergency preparedness. Nobody wants to invest in preparedness and mitigation early on, but they love, they always sit there. It's like, oh, there was an earthquake. Oh, there was a huge fire. Now let's throw a lot of resources at it. So instead of spending, $15 billion to mitigate and stop a fire, you end up responding and actually spend $150 billion in response and recovery because of not looking ahead. And that's just the numbers I kind of pulled out. $150 billion is actually real, but not spending the money up front that you need to do to save things. That's kind of what we're seeing in this. And this goes to investor confidence worldwide. This goes to how the markets deal with things. This goes to reliability of supply chains. And it also goes to deterring war. And the less we do, the less engaged we are, the more likely that we're going to have a big war on our hands that we're going to get drug into. So with all that said, covered a lot of things. Looking forward to the next STRAT podcast. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found some of this interesting to listen to. And next, probably either the next one or the one thereafter, it'll be something other than just listening to me, which I'm sure many will say, that's good. So thank you, and see you on the next STRAT.